This is the Exploring Astrology Podcast, and I'm your host, Adam Summer.
It's time for a new story. I suggest that the stories we need turned up right on time about 5,000 years ago. We need a new story. We didn't just dream our carefully individuated thoughts. We got dreamt.
Well, speaking of a news story, welcome to the Saturn podcast, a newer look, or another look at the old devil. If it's your first time to the show, welcome. It's probably Saturn that brought you here. And whether you love or hate this show, you have two Saturn fingers that you can use in the direction of the old man. Okay. And if you're a longtime listener, welcome back. I think that some of you have been expecting this podcast for some time, and that I was supposed to be doing this last month. But let me tell you, every single time I thought I was ready to do this podcast, he would disappear, then reappear with gravity's hands on my shoulders, suggesting that I sit with it just a little bit longer, kind of whispering in my ear, it's not time. Kairos has yet to arrive. So what we're going to do is kind of build a pyramidal hive made of hexagons, somehow creating a sturdy foundation for understanding Saturn's true reality. So the title of this show is kind of a riff off of Liz Green's book on Saturn, A New Look at the Old Devil. And I'm thinking that we should take another look. And I have a lot of good reasons why, which we'll find out about here in a second, looking at the great architect or the programmer of this simulation, if you will. And so Saturn at the moment is right around the Galactic Center. He is planning on a move home. He's moving into Capricorn on the 19th, depending on where you're at on the planet. That's December 19th, 2017. And hasn't been there since the late 80s, early 90s, 88 to 91, I believe are those dates. And I find this territory of the sky incredibly interesting. And if you've been with me for some time, you know why. I think that because late Sagittarius is currently where the Galactic Center is. And every year, the sun will move through this territory around the winter solstice and then ingress into Capricorn. The equinox and the solstices are those times of the year when the sun moves into cardinal signs. And when it moves in late Sag, the sun, or anything really for that matter, because Mercury's stationed retrograde there too at the beginning of the month, there's, I think, this idea of capturing visions, of being able to look into the abyss and experience awe. And yeah, hopefully be blessed with a vision or two. And then to actually do something about it whenever that planet in mind moves into Capricorn. The first steps of building the inner temple, or the outer one, whichever is preferable for your life situation at the moment. And once we start building, there's no turning around. We must commit. This is the nature of Capricorn, or the ibex, or the sea goat. We just keep on tessellating. And we learn patience, transcendent endurance, Saturn's greatest gift, next to having compassion for other beings, sentient beings. And it also teaches us the importance of news and all the work it takes to visit these planetary flowers. So I can make, hopefully, some sweet, sweet honey. And so, speaking of, let's do a little bit of that before we get into the content of this show. All right, time for a little bit of news. The music, I guess you could call it music, is the sound of Saturn. If you haven't heard these planetary sounds, Google it, check it out. They're super bizarre. So for starters, the greatest way of supporting the show is through Patreon. It's kind of a no-brainer. If you really enjoy this content and you find yourself waiting with jittery toes for the next podcast to come out, which I do have a new flow with this. I'm not going to be doing it every single week anymore. It's going to be a little bit more inspired, I suppose, unpredictable. But through Patreon, there's so many good gifts like access to the horoscopes, my patron-only podcasts, the Lunar Raffle where you can win a free reading with me, the CIA Raffle as well, the panel we just did in Denver for Chris Brennan's astrology group, his meetup, talking about the transits of 2018. Those are going to be accessible. The parlor talking about 2018. The class about Time Lord techniques. There's so much that's on there. And so...
Wait, can I ask just a quick question?
Yeah, what is it?
Well, I'm just real interested in how your Patreon experience has been going.
Great. I mean, I'd give it two exceptions. That one, it is a little interesting to me that it's such a small fraction of people that do listen to every podcast I put out that are a part of the Patreon. But honestly, I'm not complaining because it's been a game changer. It's been amazing.
Game changer. That's one of my favorite phrases.
Yeah, so two, people do find it hard to navigate. That is the Patreon site. It seems pretty streamlined to me, but I recommend everyone get the app. It makes it super easy, and yeah, that's the way.
Well, people really do enjoy their K2 living. Like South Node living, right? It's comfortable down there. And, it's just real hard to teach old humans new tricks. And trust me, I'm an old man, and I understand.
Yeah, I do too. Thanks for the advice, Saturn. So another way of supporting the show, and this is an exciting thing actually, is that through iTunes, if you use the app, like the podcast app in your iPhone, and I think it's the same with Stitcher and Podcast Addict, it's much easier to leave stars and reviews. And you guys, this is a huge help to the podcast, because if someone, say, searches astrology podcast on iTunes or on Google, the more energy through stars and reviews that are on there, the greater the possibility of them finding it. And so, super easy to do. Just go to iTunes or on your podcast app and scroll down. I have 100 shows listed on there, so you just scroll down really quick and then you'll see it. How to give stars, how to give reviews.
Why do they make it so difficult? It's always been so difficult to do this.
I know. And Apple's usually streamlined. So anyway, they just made the fix, old man.
Old man? Huh?
I mean...
No. It's true. I am older than dirt. And I made dirt, just so you remember that.
Yes. Yeah, got it. The show is also brought to you by Solar Fire. What has been happening ever since Chris and I did our show on the Q&A, but talking a lot about Time Lord systems, is people have been asking me a lot of questions about them. Well, the best way of having everything that you need in one program is through Solar Fire. You can do the zodiacal releasing both from Fortune and Spirit, and the Dasa cycles for Daria, so much more. It's all in there. And so if you use promo code SOMA on their site, you get 15% off. And if you're in the UK, if you're in Australia, it's not going to work for you. There's another link that I can send you. And so if you're interested and you're in those countries, just shoot me an email and I will hook you up.
Well, it warms my cold heart to know that people are finally learning about the past. You haven't been so good at it over the past few millennia. And these two techniques are my favorite, and I so love using Solar Fire to look at them and, don't tell anybody, but it's my secret trick. to understand in time. I use them in combination like you're doing. I use both of them, and it's an amazing thing.
Why did you just tell everybody? That's partly what the class is going to be like at the end of the month for all of the patrons.
I'm so sorry. I really am. I'm so sorry.
All good. All good. Also, remember to use Saturn as a promo code on my site to get 21% off until the winter solstice. This does not include the complete reading, nor does it include the apprenticeship, but all my classes and all of the readings that I offer, aside from the complete and the journeys, it will work. So that is Saturn as a promo code. And yes, I do accept Bitcoin now. And this is also true for the apprenticeship.
What do you think about that Bitcoin?
Honestly, I'd rather not talk about it, but I think it's a really exciting thing. And what do you think about it?
It's too new to tell, but I think it's speculation and excitement around what the new currency is going to look like here in a bit.
Something like that, yeah. And so lastly, today, I launched enrollment for the upcoming apprenticeship. We're going to start February 15th. That is the Aquarius eclipse, and it goes until the autumn equinox. It's a really incredible way of learning astrology. There's community involved. This year, I'm implementing labs with teacher's assistants. I'm encouraging everybody to be giving readings to classmates every single week. I think that this is going to be the best year of the apprenticeship yet. And I even subtitled it to mean on Kairos and Cosmos, and I'll go much more into that in the future. But if you're interested in being a part of the apprenticeship program, please shoot me an email at exploringastrology@gmail.com, and we can begin to make sure that you are a part of next year.
Can I be a part of it?
You can teach it. How about that?
No. I would like to learn from you.
No, you don't.
You're right. I probably don't. I would get triggered over and over and over again.
Precisely. Old man and his triggers. So anyways, thanks Saturn for being a part of this news segment.
Absolutely.
And I think we're done here. But a lot of exciting news. Really, my mind's wrapped around the apprenticeship at the moment. And if you, again, want to be a part of that, just shoot me an email at exploringastrology@gmail.com. And so I say we begin with the question, why now? One of the reasons of why now, like I mentioned in the introduction, is that Saturn is about to ingress into his own sign, Capricorn. He's going to be spending 5 years in both of his signs. That's Capricorn and Aquarius. Spends 2.5 years per sign. And so the next 5 years, we can say just from that alone, are going to be Saturnian. We're also going to go deeper into that, understanding how to see it more specifically in our own charts and stuff like this. But yes, December 19th, as Solar Fire tells me, and I'm sure it's at different points on the planet, but we'll just say around the solstice, Saturn is going to ingress, holding the hands of the sun into Capricorn. The last time this happened was in February of 1988. And then moved into Aquarius, February of 1991. And so we're dealing with 29 and a half years since Saturn was in Capricorn. For a lot of you, that is those that are in their Saturn return at the moment, this is the return. That's where it was when you were born. Now it's there again. And again, we're going to cover that at some point during this show. A couple other really important points to mention is, say, well, when's Saturn, or if Saturn is going to ingress back through its retrograde into Sag again? The answer is no. It moves into Capricorn in a couple weeks or less than that. And then we'll remain there until March 21st of 2020. That is the vernal equinox of the big year, my friends. And so that is a good date to write down in your journal. And then also this point around the Galactic Center, I kind of feel bad that I haven't given enough voice or enough of my ink to this, because there's so much that's happening around it. So again, Mercury station retrograde in the Galactic Center. Saturn is there right now, or at least very close to it. And there's some other factors as well. For example, with the Mercury, okay, that was December 3rd when it stationed retrograde at 29 degrees of Sag, just a degree away from Saturn. And I think, being that we're still in it, actually I'm recording this on the day of the Mercury cycle ending and beginning. So for me, that's when Mercury crosses between the Earth and the Sun. That's when he is closest to us. And being that the whole retrogradation started around this awe-inspiring, ineffable place in the cosmos, we ask questions like, what's the big idea? What is it that I really need to work on? What needs improvement? Do I need a vision for that? How is it that I can stay humble? How I can release my triggers? How can I learn from others? Basically, how can I formulate my questions better? And this retrograde goes until the 22nd of December, so a few days after Saturn's ingress, the day after the winter's solstice. And when you look at the chart for that day, you see that Venus is there at 27 degrees of Sag. She's connecting to where our minds have been, where a lot of our work has been happening. She's hopefully to feel amorous and some warmth around what it is that we've been up to. Some deep reflections are shown by this, that I think. And also, where's Venus in the sky? Well, she's not in the sky. She's in her own transition, going from the morning sky to the evening sky. To me, this is the darkest part of her cycle. She's not there for a good portion of time. And this conjunction with the sun, when she's on the other side of the sun, I think it happens on January 8th. And maybe I'll do some talking about that come January. But important, because she does that. But then also, there's a new moon this Sunday, December 17th, 2 days before Saturn ingresses into Capricorn. At what degree? 26 degrees of Sagittarius. So with all of this potential of planets coming to greet it, going retrograde on it, moving on from it, a new moon blooming out of it, the main thing we need to be thinking about, and as we go on in this show with everything I'm about to say about Saturn, is what needs to be addressed, how to best execute, where do we need to say yes, and then also say no. What does that look like? For me, by God, I'm on the verge of another move. It was always planned. My situation up here in the mountains was temporary, but I'm moving down to Boulder. And I'm seeing all of this down in my fourth house. It's all about to move on into my fifth. And so it's actually a really exciting thing to be able to go through everything and realize that this step, this move that I'm making is one of the biggest steps for me, just we'll say psychologically speaking. And so I'm actually really excited about it. And so another way, a really important way with all cycles, to try to understand really what this is all about, because it's so challenging, ever so challenging, and even philosophically I'm opposed to it from a lot of different angles, talking about the future and these transits and what they represent for the world, for this country, for you, and all of this. Because, as you all know, if you study astrology, it really is in the complexity of a given chart of a person that these transits affect everyone differently. And so I do it because I know it's entertaining for a lot of you, and also it does build context for the work that you're doing on yourself, or maybe you're working with clients and stuff like this. But ever so helpful to look back to 88. February of 88 is when Saturn last moved into Capricorn and then left in February of 91. And so recently, in the last South Park of this season, the boys were on a journey, and they found some stranger things and decided to listen to some music from that time period.
Dude, come on, this is not kick-ass 80s music. Hold on to the dice. Richard Marx, 1988. Do we really need music? Yeah, Craig just has the wrong stuff. Forget your Pandora. I'm doing Spotify. 80s music, okay, there. Oh yeah, that's better. Can we go, please? Give me this.
So when looking back to that time, the two main themes that crop up in my imagination are around the World Wide Web and walls. So we'll start electronically. That the internet is a little bit different than the World Wide Web, first of all. That the World Wide Web was actually invented by CERN, or at CERN, by a scientist named Tim Berners-Lee in 89. So last time Saturn was in Capricorn. And it was originally conceived and developed to meet the demand for automatic information sharing between scientists and universities around the world. Now, it's a fascinating idea because, Saturn, as we'll get deeper and deeper into throughout this show, is indeed reality. And so the study thereof, especially in its rulership of Aquarius, relates to this idea. And the World Wide Web, this idea is Aquarian, sure, through the technology, but also it's very mercurial, we can say, sharing information with findings. And, we all know what the World Wide Web has done for the world, and no one knows what it's going to do. That is, there's a few things that always come to mind around this one. One, the effect that it has on us socially. It's changed the game through social media. But also, something that I'm trying to reprogram myself with at the moment is information retention. My power of my own intellect to focus and retain. That seems to be a problem when all the information in the world can just be Googled. And the other is a little step away from the World Wide Web, though I would also say connected, and that is around this idea of the exponentiation of technological growth into AI and VR, to where soon there's going to be the capacity of indiscernible replication of voice, face, and whatever wants to be programmed into that person. So we could create a replica, say, of myself, and then create a podcast where all I'm doing is talking shit like the Leo King about the astrology world and all of this. If you haven't seen it, I don't recommend it, but it's a scene. And I could be ruined. Anyone could be ruined by this. There's so many things that can happen because the voice replications are almost there. And to be able to create three-dimensional models and whatnot and then cast it out on the internet, how would anybody that is intaking that information going to know the difference? And so ethics is a huge issue around this. I mean, the World Wide Web, it started in an innocent place, just like most things, to share information between scientists. And now, look where we are. Now, I think the same, and we could, of course, go real deep into both of these ideas, but walls, right? I think our energy is much better spent than on walls, but bridges. Building bridges, not walls. Well, in the late 80s, that's when the Berlin Wall came down, with what Trump is doing now, not just with the wall between the US and Mexico and that scare, but also messing around in the Middle East with these walls and these borders and these crazy ideas that walls, of course, divide. They don't unite us. And I think that's what the World Wide Web does. The World Wide Web can't really fully shine in its glory if it's limited, if there is restrictions to our freedom to say and find whatever it is that we are interested in. And so just two ideas around the connection between that time and this time. I know that there's many of you that are listening that were born around that time, so happy Saturn Return. But also for everyone that was alive around that time, finding cool examples, relevant examples of what bricks were either taken down or put up in your own life back then, and taking a very objective stance and looking at it and then seeing where you're at now. How far have you come? Because whenever we're contemplating Saturn, that is what we're dealing with. How well we have dealt with reality. How well we have really done the work. Are we aligned? These are big questions. Or have we built more walls than bridges?
Get on with your work. Repeat after me. An acre is the area of a rectangle whose length is 1 furlong and whose width is 1 cubit.
So who is Saturn, really? If you haven't ever read Saturn by Liz Green, the new look at the old devil, the original copy has one of the most incredible pieces of work on it. I think it's by this artist, Peretz Kaminsky. And it's just this amazing illustration of Saturn as Lord Time. He's horned. There's no scythe in sight, but there's a lot of snakes, dragons, four-sided stars, triangles, and the like. And he looks like young Devendra Banhart or Charles Manson version of Devendra Banhart. And it's just such a gorgeous illustration. And when you look at it, there is a emotional response that you get when just being drawn into it and be like, oh, this is Saturn. Like, this is the reality of time, how serpents in time, the Ouroboros eating its tail, of how it is this interesting reminder of timelessness, that whenever you're thinking of reincarnation or the idea of karma or old age or any of this, that there's a really helpful remedy to that thought process if it's pulling you down with lead claws. And that is the idea, probably the correct one, that you're eternal. And so that has a very paradoxical effect, I think, on the psyche, in knowing that it brings you into the present moment where you can fully show up without being haunted by the past or being too worried about the future. On the back of the original copy of Liz's book, she writes, Saturn symbolizes a psychic process as well as a quality or kind of experience. He is not merely a representative of pain, restriction, and discipline. He is also a symbol of the psychic process, natural to all human beings, by which an individual may utilize the experience of pain, restriction, and discipline as a means for greater consciousness and fulfillment. Saturn is the greatest teacher. I don't think when it comes to teachings and getting us in line and knowing how to navigate our lives, there's a better teacher than Saturn. And there's this wonderful book that I do highly recommend to everyone that's called The Greatness of Saturn by Robert Svoboda. And it's a therapeutic myth. He talks about the myth of Shani and this king. And I'm not going to really read from it because context is important with all of it. But I highly, highly, highly recommend this book because it helps you fall in love with the old man. And as far as my own take on Saturn and what he represents, I think we can see it like this in poetic terms, that he was the first to invert the triangle, placing two of them together, creating heaven and earth. The Star of David, holding out his lantern of time. This is taken from the image on Liz's book. Infinite coiled serpents are revealed, flashes of your lifetimes, scrolls of your soul, murders of crows. When we know our body's limitations and employ skillful means to grow into those limits, we know Saturn. When we possess the power to focus the mind, not distracted by the babble in the hive, we sharpen Saturn. When body and mind find homeostasis, a hum will appear between your ears, not the hive, but the queen, tessellating, tinkering with chaos. When his temple crystallizes, the sacred floods into the mundane. Work becomes a whistle. Saturn finds his element. Saturn is the greatest because he is the architect, the god of this dimension. Play by his rules, then you become the architect. And so it's always nice when we're talking about a planet in depth to understand its correlations. For example, Saturn's color is black and blue, like a black and blue eye, because a fist hit it. That is the reality of talking shit. Metal, lead, day, Saturday, hour, midnight, stone, blue sapphire or onyx, plant, tobacco, temperature, cold and dry like a desert night, animal, the crow or the raven, God, Odin, attitude, disciplined, gift, depression, and its reward, scent, frankincense, weapon, sickle, esoteric idea, karma, the movie, the fountain, music, tool, 10,000 days, finger, the middle one, time of the year, the winter solstice as we move into it, the practice, sitting, the mantra, Om Shani Namaha. So it helps us to contextualize who in the hell we're actually talking about. This is Saturn, right? He's not something, and I do highly recommend this. Like if you are on your Saturn return, if you have Saturn transiting something challenging in your chart, if you're in Sade Sati, if it's something around Saturn and you find yourself saying in your own mind or doing with your own actions, fuck Saturn. Ooh, I highly recommend backing up and trying to apologize, because that is not the relationship that we need to have to Saturn. We need to worship him. We need to understand his voice on our shoulder, always doing the right thing. So Marsilio Ficino from the 15th century in the Book of Life, he writes, very often, therefore, in human affairs, we are subject to Saturn through idleness, solitude, or strength, through theology or more secret philosophy, through superstition, magic, agriculture, and through sadness. It kind of sounds like life, doesn't it? And one of the most valuable things in this life are diamonds. And how are diamonds created? But through immense, impossible amounts of time. Heat and pressure. So if we're not patient, if we can't take the heat, and if the pressure breaks us, if we're not flexible enough, then we don't know how to bend or we get bent out of shape, don't we? And so if we can deal with time, heat, and pressure, we too we become Vajra. We become diamond-like, right? Naturally, Saturn has gorgeous rings, right? Probes have shown us this. Flat earthers, I don't even know why you're still listening to the show, but rings of Saturn, do you believe in that too or not? Are they round? Are they bubbles around Saturn? But these rings are great symbols. I think that all of the planets can teach us a little bit, not just by their astronomical nature, but also by the symbol that is used for them. And so rings as restriction, sure, but when you look at the symbol for Saturn, it is the cross of matter. You can see that as the 4 elements or of incarnation. And then there's a crescent that's moving downwards into the earth. I always like to think of it as the sickle being put into the earth, whether you're sowing or it's the idea of a job well done. Like I like doing it with my machete, like tossing my machete into the earth like that. But it's a rootedness. It's an essential lesson of being here, not somewhere else, not Neptune land, Never land, with the lost boys and all of that. No, here, and doing the work and finding the whistle within it, finding joy within all of the challenges of this reality. Saturn, again, is God of this reality. And the image that we oftentimes use in thinking about Saturn is that of him as this old-looking curmudgeon with a sickle and a hood. Well, that's Father Time. Father Time comes around with the new year. So you could see that as the winter solstice. You could see that as the new year like we celebrate it. But it's this idea of, we all know it, the feeling that begins to happen. It's already percolating probably in all of you that are listening to this at the moment, that there's a big change on the horizon that you want to implement. But why is it every single year of your life, it begins to fizzle away? After a few days, a week, maybe even a month, maybe you even made it a year, but it still goes away. Like, what is that? Well, I think it's a trick that relates to Saturn. Perhaps we forget how to propitiate him. We forget how to worship him because we become too selfish. I think if we are depressed or we're reaching for something outside of ourselves, we're terribly self-focused. And that Saturn teaches us through his dignities, for example. He's exalted in Libra. Why might that be? That Saturn's favorite place to be in the zodiac is in Libra. Perhaps because it points to all of his relations. Perhaps it points outside of ourselves. It shows us the incredible value in empathy, connection, compassion, works for other people, the idea of service, in other words. Whereas it's fallen in Aries. Why might that be? Because it is inherently selfish. Not that Aries are selfish. You know I'm not that simple-minded. But the Aries archetype is an explosion of novelty. It's the I am principle. Well, Saturn isn't trying to teach us how to fall in love with I. Not so much. Maybe with the I that exists within life, or living, or friends, or wife. There's no I in husband. But I is in other places, right? And figuring that out. Like, it's a really fun thing to contemplate also when you look at planetary joys. Why is Saturn most comfortable in the 12th house? Or perhaps because Saturn offers us the capacity for discipline, for chiseling out parts of our day and understanding how to hack it. Like the incredible benefit that I personally get from Tim Ferriss's book, Tools of Titans and Tribe of Mentors. 2 phrases that I think are very Saturnian by nature. Saturn wasn't a Titan, his dad was, Uranus, and he cut his balls off. But what a tool that was. It created Venus. But the tribe of mentors, I think this is a really, really important concept that I've been rereading Iron John as of late, because I got some buddies that are in this Iron John study group that I want to be a part of. And there's just so much, because my mind has been on Saturn for the past good while. And there's so much richness within this book around issues of the father. And I think that when we're contemplating Saturn, at least mythologically speaking, and it can extend to your life, to all of our lives, is that Saturn had daddy issues. Again, he put the blade to his father's genitals. And then also Saturn being father to many, but one really specific one, Chiron. And Chiron too has daddy issues. And it's how this leaps throughout generations, how it's not necessarily our father's fault. Now, Iron John is a book for men, but I think it's a book for everyone, ultimately. That for the past 140 years or so, or 150 years, or however you want to place that, since the Industrial Revolution, when dad and now mom isn't really around anymore, that's a really bizarre, incredibly rare scenario for a child to grow up in. And I've even had dreams about this, kind of a longing for a childhood where I had more time with my father and I saw what he was into, and I was able to kind of pick up a trade maybe even from him. But that wasn't the case. My dad was gone Monday and would come back Friday or Saturday every single week of my life. I hardly even knew my dad. And as I've been in deep work with Saturn over the past couple months, and reading Iron John as well, just it has created a really surprising compassion for my own father, who I didn't have the best relationship with, and I don't even have in my life anymore. He passed away over 18 years ago. But just this really interesting, like, oh, it wasn't your fault. And it wasn't Saturn's fault. And it wasn't Chiron's fault. And it wasn't Uranus's fault. And in fact, it was nobody's fault. It was just the circumstances of the society at large, for some odd reason, at this time that you pass through in this time and space dimension. Saturn is the circumstances of the given culture in time and space. Jupiter is the philosophy or the zeitgeist of that time. All the planets have their role. But Saturn is what is. And as Saturn moves into Capricorn and moves towards Pluto, who's been in Capricorn since 2008, and then Jupiter trails behind, and they all come together in 2020, I think there's a reckoning. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it gets me excited, because I think that it relates to ideas like tribe of mentors, that perhaps we can heal this father wound, we can heal this reality wound, we can mend our relationship to time by finding incredible teachers. And not necessarily out of our peers. We can learn a lot from our peers, but I think that we need elders. We don't need to just toss them into homes. There's so much wisdom inherent within the soul of an elder, and there's something to that. And it can be 10 years your elder, 20 years your elder. It's just important to have close relationships and, in a way, intimate relationships with those who have walked steps before you, to not have an arrogance and an anger around them or that which they have done and stuff like that. And so it's ever so important to never forget to play. Like, so far we've talked about a lot of the heaviness of Saturn, and it's not all heavy. That Saturn was said to be the lord of the golden age. So looking back 12,000 years or so into the Sati Yuga, it was said that Shani, Saturn, was the ruler of that age. Now, whether that was so or not, it still points a gentle middle finger, a pointing middle finger, an accidental, oh look, that, at the greatness, again, of Saturn. And here's a little clip of Robert Bly, who's the author of Iron John, who has the sun at 0 degrees Capricorn, believe it or not, where Saturn is about to be on the 19th of this month. talking about father stuff.
So young men are trying to learn masculinity from each other. But from the ancient point of view, that it doesn't work. You can't learn anything from people your own age. And in any case, the ones that have the intense sense of the masculine in its joyful aspect, not in its domineering or pentagon aspect. In Australia, for example, are the old men, the Aborigines. And they spend something like 67% of their time, the traditional old men, in working with mythological material, which is primarily with the boys. So the boys are suffering from a starvation then. You can call it father energy or you can call it older man energy, either way. There's a father hunger. There's an old man hunger. That's tremendous.
So there's a symbol that relates pretty specifically to Saturn, and that is of the Star of David, like I talked about, the two equilateral triangles combined to create the six-pointed star. Now, yes, it is something that is found in the North Pole of the actual Saturn as well. We'll get into that in a second. But it's also an alchemical symbol. So you often see this in the old texts where you can see Saturn on one side of it, Jupiter on another, Venus, the sun, the moon, Mars, and then the alchemical symbols for salt, sulfur, mercury, and those being in the middle of this, oftentimes depicted with the two dragons that are eating each other's tails, which relates to eternity, which I think is the great reminder. I think it's the teaching, essentially, of Saturn, that if we do the work, we don't just feel good. We feel a part of something timeless. We align, energetically speaking, to the truth of our very nature. And I think this is what the bees got it from. That, for example, it was in the 80s. There's mixed resources on this one, and I didn't want to go too deep into it, but there was one that said that the actual confirmation of this hexagon on the North Pole of Saturn was in, I believe, 88 is what I'm looking at here. I might have got that from Wikipedia, not the best source. But it's there. We know it's there. And when you look at a beehive, they're using the same shape to create one of the strongest structures on the planet to do their work. Busy as a bee. The feeling that we all have most of the time. That busy is a choice, my friends. That to use busy as an excuse for not hanging out or for not doing this with that group of people or whatever it is, it's simply an excuse. Busy is a choice. And I think it's very important to understand that. For me, my own relationship to that word is to try to never say it, because I don't want to ever feel busy, even though technically, sure, I'm filled up. There's a lot going on. I'm dedicated. I'm disciplined. Yeah, I'm busy. But to say that, like when someone says that to you, I'm so busy, I don't have any time, like life is crazy, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't, from either end of that equation. And so just to think about it as the bee is like, we work because we love to work. We fly like a bumblebee aerodynamically shouldn't be able to fly, but it does. We shouldn't be able to move forward in certain tragedies or traumas that we experience in life, but we do, and we will do it again. That is Saturn. The Saturn return will come for you. Sade Sati will come for you. Big Saturn transits will come. And it's just important to understand that as long as if you keep doing this work, you are tessellating. You are repeating the hexagon. You are doing this and you're making honey. You're bringing sweetness into your life. The bees, they never sleep, nor does Saturn. And I think that to some degree we serve Saturn, or we could even say we serve the queen, the muse. and to never ever be too attached to the outcome, but just to do our best and to keep working. That in our own psyche, there is a hive of voices. You can see these as the planets, all these little different selves that we have, but at the center of all of them, the one that is commanding the whole situation is the queen. That queen, we can feminize Saturn here for a second, right? Now, on a personal note, once upon a time, I got the picture of my iris taken, and I've always been told that I have this funny geometry around my pupil. But it wasn't until I actually saw the picture of what it is that I saw it. I have a hexagon around my pupil. And so I've had a few friends along the way that have related me to Saturn in not the most positive light, kind of in a negative sense, we can say that I'm Saturn, that I'm all business, that I'm all work, that I'm too disciplined, that I'm all these things. And it's not, I wouldn't argue with that. Like, there's been phases in my life where I've had to focus a little bit more, but I do still have fun. I still have a ton of friends. I play a lot of music. I'm silly as it gets. And so I think I have a healthy relationship to Saturn. Perhaps it's because he's conjunct Pluto and my moon. I don't know. I love Saturn. And I think that big Saturn transits are super exciting times to level up, essentially. And yeah, I'm just trying. I'm trying to change y'all's relationship to him. That if we turn the corner and contemplate, say, the greatness of him, perhaps him as the Lord of the golden age, right? We can see, and I get this from mythic astrology. I really like this idea that is laser etched now in my mind. But the concept of mentor, the Saturnian idea, is itself drawn from classical mythology. Mentor, a character in Homer's Odyssey, is the elderly advisor to Telemachus, if that's how you say his name, Odysseus's youthful heir. While Telemachus sought in vain for his absent father, it was Mentor who guided his actions with sage-like counsel. At any rate, it appeared to be Mentor, in fact. Pallas Athena was speaking to Telemachus using Mentor as her vehicle. The relationship between Mentor and Telemachus brings out several important points. First of all, the advisor, Mentor, is not the young man's father. As Bly actually points out, a young man cannot be initiated into the mysteries of life by his own father. The bond is too close. The mentor needs a certain amount of detachment from his protege. And so I think this brings optimism into the situation, because if you are listening to this and you have father problems, like many of us do, and especially if you're a man and you feel that, well, there is a way of healing it. Find mentors. Find a good role model. Establish that relationship, because it will help tremendously. And there's so many other ways of seeing into this greatness of Saturn. For example, pointing back to Robert Savoda's book, there's this idea of, well, there's an argument amongst this council of like how Venus is the best, or Mercury is the best, or Rahu or Ketu is the best planet. But it's Saturn that wins, and Saturn also in this story takes everything away from the king. I can't pronounce his last name, so I'm not going to even try. Everything, even his hands and his feet. And it was at the end of it all, just imagining him on a pile of ash. And he says to Shani, or Saturn, please, I hope that you are not this hard on anybody else. My words. And it was that made Saturn smile. That was the right answer. That when we go through certain things in life, it's not like, don't ever do this to me again. But please, I just hope for the sake of all sentient beings that nobody else has to experience this amount of pain. That's the right approach. That is compassionate thinking. That is listening to Saturn. Body like a mountain. Heart like an ocean. Mind like the sky. Dogen, the Zen monk poet, said that. So that brings us to the Saturn return, where it's my thinking that we should be more like buffalo with the Saturn return. That is, not to try to outrun the storm, but to get shoulder to shoulder with our peers and face it and walk into it. Makes it quicker that way. But the Saturn return is something that happens to all of us from around, in my opinion, 27 and a half to 30 years old. And there's highlight points between those 2.5 years for sure. But once you're tuned to it, once you go through it, you can't escape the stories. So ever since I've been preparing for this podcast, there's been a few that have been really interesting to me. For one, Martin Shaw, one of my favorite authors. I was listening to an interview that Charles Eisenstein did with him about story. And he was telling his own story about doing Vision Quest work, as he calls it, wilderness vigils, and weaving in story to this. Well, that all started to come together for him in his Saturn return years. Also, that great documentary that just came out called Jim and Andy. I think that's the title of it, but it's where Jim Carrey plays Andy Kaufman in Man on the Moon. And he kind of talks about it in it, but I was looking up stuff as well because he had referenced his own father dying and how special his own father was to him. And then the fame that came through Ace Ventura and Dumb and Dumber and stuff like that. Well, he was in his Saturn return in those years. And so you see this, that there's usually a lot of weight, a lot of life circumstances, that is, the reality is this, that come around those years, because I think it is a celestial initiation for us. We have to experience some of that hardship because maybe it was in our blind spot. But then there's also this slow growth, like the diamond growth, that is starting to occur around that time. Both true in Jim and Martin's cases, absolutely true in my own life. A lot of my lessons were somewhat subtle, but there was a lot of relationship woes. There was a lot of stuff around location and me choosing where to live. And I was just creating a lot of unnecessary suffering for myself. And I think that the ultimate lesson that I had myself during my Saturn return back in 2012, when it was peaking, was to surrender to a particular place. And also, quite specifically, if you've been with me for a long time, to surrender to this work. And so I had been doing this show way before my Saturn return, but like when the Saturn return started is when I began to get much more serious about it. And there's also this other thought, it comes from Jim Rohn, that was very present in my mind in the Saturn return years as I was getting claustrophobic in certain communities that I was running in. And it's this: you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. If you honestly apply that to your life, that is a very helpful statement, because you can see it. Why is that particular person in your life? Like, do you want them to be a part of the sum average of who you actually are as well? Or do you need to ask Saturn, hey, please, can I just borrow that scythe for a second? And then just cut the cord. Letting go of people is such a hard thing. Can't forget that Saturn rules Capricorn. Well, what's opposite Capricorn but Cancer? The moon. The moon attaches. It gets nostalgic. It's like, but I can't. They're family. I can't. I've known them since I was a kid. I can't. But they're toxic. We all know this situation. There's people in our lives that are slowly sucking away at our life force and our potential. And it is not a good idea to keep people like that around. And that's not me being heartless. That's me being Saturnian around this. Me knowing how important that this all is. And so when we apply these hard truths to our lives, when we establish a practice, when we find our way and we feel aligned, there are so many little moments that can come to us, like James Joyce calls aesthetic arrest, where we're like, oh, that. It's like all this hard work for just that second, that millisecond of knowing, of ecstasy, of something that just may come through the Galactic Center where Saturn currently is, and again, where that Mercury is stationed retrograde. That it's also important to think about the duo that is Jupiter and Saturn. That Jupiter is all about growth and expansion, the words that we use with him. In Saturn, we say restrictive and disciplined and stuff like this, but perhaps it's like this. Perhaps we need to exchange the growth for depth. That we're missing something around Saturn, that we don't really have tradition in the West. And we need that. We need that Vajra / diamond-like awareness of like seeing how important it is to have some sort of a tradition, to be aligned with something that is greater than us, to be humbled. Because if we don't, that's where Saturn's lead poisoning comes into the picture. And that as well can humble us. And so it's the Saturn return between 27 and a half and 30. And then you look to the late 50s to 60, and then the late 80s to 90. Those are the Saturn return years. But there's other ways of seeing this. And by the way, the reason why I use the 27 and a half is because of 10,000 days. That is 10,000 hours. If you apply 10,000 days, that's 27.39 years on the planet. And I find that really curious. We've got the forever 27s around this. We've got really, I think, there's other astrological factors that come into play, like the progressed lunar return, nodal opposition. There's a few others. I think that energetically, or I'll even go as far to say biologically speaking, the Saturn return begins around then and then begins to taper off on our 30th birthday. But there are these points that are really important to pay attention to within the Saturn return. Like if you have Saturn, say, in Capricorn, that when Saturn moves into Capricorn by transit, that's a highlighted point in your Saturn return. And it usually will bring a heightened experience with it. There's also the exact return. That is when it comes back to the exact degree and arc minute that it was in when you were born. And so there's a lot of different ways of studying this. Were you born during the day or at night? There's a lot of observation, thanks to Chris and Lisa and a lot of the Hellenistic astrologers around this sect idea that people born at night have a harder time with the Saturn return. I'm beginning to notice this myself. So another thing is the 7-year itch. Not the Marilyn Monroe movie, but the idea that, say, after you listen to this podcast, you have a great idea. You're like, I'm going to implement this. This is what I'm going to command into this world, my reality on the solstice when Saturn moves into Capricorn. This is what I'm setting out to do. Well, my recommendation to you then is to give yourself a 7-year plan, to not quit until you get to that 7-year mark, and then you can renegotiate terms when you get there. But don't quit until that. For me, with this podcast, I didn't have that 7-year thing from the beginning back in 2009. I said that I would do 20 shows, see how it went, and then continue if it needed to continue. And it was obvious that I was going to continue, so I did. And then the 7-year idea came in, and so the 7-year thing for me came up about 2 years ago. And I had a little crisis with being an astrologer, but also specifically this podcast, where I really wanted to chuck and compost this podcast because it's so much work for me to do it. And I do love it. It's a labor of love, but it's free, right? And so how can I redistribute these calories and my focus into something else was my main crisis. Like, how do I do that? And I ended up surrendering to the podcast because it's a huge part of what I do, and it offers education and entertainment to thousands of you. And so in a way, I surrendered to the service that I have stumbled into. But I highly recommend that, especially with relationships. So the idea of marriage, for example, it's a very Saturnian idea. Perhaps he's exalted in Libra because he likes the idea of death do us part. But bringing the law into an organic and magical process like love is a really curious thing. Having excuses like taxes and everything like that, like it's very Saturnian thinking to get into the idea of marriage. And it's not that I don't believe in marriage. I think it's a really romantic idea, but a lot of people get married for the wrong reasons. And it is not uncommon for people to break up or get divorced around the 7th year, before it or just after it. It is rampant. And by noticing that, I kind of have my own relationship to it now. It's like, well, why waste time and energy and money and all of this to get married unless we've been together for 7 years, unless we've cohabitated? You can have kids, you can do everything that lovers do in that 7-year period. But the idea of bringing contracts, written governmental contracts into the equation has a funny thing in its influence around the 7-year itch with Saturn. And that's a Saturn cycle. So when we're around age 7, that is when Saturn squares itself. Around 14 is when it opposes itself. Around 21 is when it squares itself again. And then around 28 is the Saturn return. Interestingly enough, in that book I referenced earlier, Iron John, there's a little boy that is 8, we'll say 7, that discovers the wild man. And that's kind of the pivot of the story, is this little boy and his own journey and learning how to steal the key back from his mother and release the wild man. And another example that I heard just the other day is that James Dean's parents, like he lost both of his parents around age 7. And so if something like that, or any big trauma or experience that happens around age 7, it can really alter the entire trajectory of our lives. As subtle as it might be, it can happen like that. And so the forever 27s, right? The reality is, Kurt, that maybe dating Courtney and being so into the needles wasn't a sustainable plan. The reality was, Janice, same with you. Jim, Brian, Jimmy, Nick, Amy, the list keeps going on. Saturn comes back around. It's like, look, you're amazing. You're basically more stardust than most of us. And you're completely ruining yourself in the process. How dare you? I'm going to take you away. Maybe next round you can figure this out. He's kind of like, are you really experienced? Now, it's always good to have experience, but it's even better to have good technique. And one of the techniques that I've been sitting with, practicing, we'll say, over the past few months, really since I've been kind of preparing myself for the Saturn class, this ingress, this podcast, all of it, is the first sutra from the Vigyan Bhairav Tantra, which is the Shiva teachings. And it's called Anapanasati. It's basically witnessing the space between your in-breath and your out-breath. Seeing the in-breath perhaps as Jupiter, that it's life-giving, right? So it's a birth. And that millisecond of space between it and your exhale which is Saturn, perhaps the death, occurs thousands and thousands of times a day without us even being aware of it. Well, when we become aware of it, a profound thing can happen. It allows us to be more mindful. I think it allows us to be more humble in the presence of crow intelligence, the space that they live in between worlds, their pernicity. But it humbles us too because it reminds us that it's happening all the time. This dance between mortality and immortality, this reminder, right? And so Saturn is said to be the Lord of Karma. All of our actions have these reactions. Yet there's certain ways, like these breathing techniques, like certain plants, that can bring us immediately into an awareness of timelessness, into the diamond-studded dome of impossibility that feels like ancient future technology or something like that. And we're in it. We feel it because we've breathed ourselves into it. And then we can even have a flash or a life review in that process. And that's a gift of Saturn as well. Like the G-hole, as I call it, like if you've ever accidentally eaten cannabis, too much of it. Life review, that's a Saturn gift. And being able to see that humbles you. Sit down, be humble. Kendrick Lamar's song, this is Saturn. We need to be humbled by this so that we can continually practice the technique, and it strengthens a part, I think, of ourselves that allows us to move through the world and in a way be impenetrable in doing so. That it's not that tragedy won't happen, that sadness won't happen, that the whole gamut and cornucopia of emotion will not occur. It always will. But it's our relationship to those feelings and those experiences that get to change with good technique and practice if employed by Saturn. And I used to say that it's 10,000 hours of doing something when it like really sticks or you become masterful over it. But I'm not so sure anymore. And it's because of this guy, Tim Ferriss.
Even if the data said, for most people, it takes 10,000 hours, well, for most people, they do things the wrong way. Or certainly at least, it's true. I mean, because what choice do they have? They can't become an expert in everything, so what do? They look at what appears to have the most commercial success, like a Rosetta Stone, and they go buy a Rosetta Stone. It's not the fastest way.
One of the attractions of the 10,000 hours is I know what I'm doing now. I'm becoming an incredible violinist, and if I practice, I'll get to Carnegie Hall. This other thing is I'll just keep on learning. How are you finding that so far? You've been at it for, 10 years or 15 years now of, learn. Mm-hmm. What happens over that sequence of events for people like you who do that?
Yep. So over time, I get better at acquiring skills. So the meta skill.
Right.
I think that if I'm applying my 10,000 hours towards anything, it's probably that. Like the Isaac Asimov, I don't know, I think it was Asimov who wrote like 15 million books. But at one point, I remember an interviewer asked him about one of the subjects he'd written about, and he had no idea. He couldn't answer it. And they go, well, you wrote a book about it. And he goes, I did, but I've written a lot of books. And they go, well, what are you an expert on? And he goes, I'm an expert at being an expert. For me, variety is the spice of life, and that doesn't mean that I shortchange myself. I mean, I feel like I can get to a very high level in these various fields in a relatively short period of time, certainly a year or less. And the incremental gains past that point are just not appealing to me. I think it's a very individual choice. If you are, through God-given skill, capable of becoming the best in the world at X, I feel typically people know that early on. I mean, if you're Tiger Woods and you're instead of drawing pirate ships, you're drawing trajectories of different irons. I'm not kidding. I saw this drawing. It's like, that's not normal. That's not normal. But for most people, I feel like they have the capacity to be exceptionally good in the top 5% in the world in many different areas, but they may not have or be able to identify the raw attributes that are going to push them into, bobsledding, because there are only so many things that you can try. And for me, I could try to become perfect in Japanese, which of course will never happen because I won't be perfect in English. Or I could get to the point where I can converse like this in maybe 20 languages by the end of my life, and it's just more appealing.
So it doesn't mean that I still don't relate to the 10,000 hours, but I really enjoy Tim's perspective. He's got Saturn trine his south node. So the rulers of his nodes, Aries, Libra, are conjunct in Gemini. There's so much that we can learn from this guy because of the questions that he asks, and also employing these techniques. An expert at being an expert, funny. An expert at learning, better. That's the way I relate to it. And so as we get into the tail end of the show, I think it's important to talk about some of the shadows of Saturn. Now, for example, the only reason why you're suffering, if you are suffering in this moment, is because you're too focused on yourself. That's what it does. The exaltation and the fall, the Libra versus the Aries. That how to propitiate Saturn is to help people that are less fortunate, to volunteer, to not necessarily put the blue sapphire or the onyx all over your body and throw black sesame seeds to a murder of crows. Sure, that's helpful, and I'm sure it can entertain Saturn a little bit, but I think this idea of service is a kind of universal solution to our suffering. That is, when we start helping other people, it begins to lift us out of this darkness that we find ourselves in. And also, of course, that we also learn this in the greatness of Saturn, that having compassion and empathy for other sentient beings, like this is a huge part of the Saturn process of realizing that everybody has Saturn somewhere. Everyone is suffering somewhere. And when we can have compassion for that, it's incredibly helpful. That our world and your world and the world around us, it wants to be admired. And so perhaps on Saturdays, we wear all black, we go and find the crows, we feed them black sesame seeds, we volunteer at a soup kitchen, we keep our middle finger from flipping out towards anybody. And then also in our free time, we're building temples to pray to inside of ourselves, because every day we're praying to temples. Your coffee machine is a temple. Your workplace is a temple. Your car is a temple. Every single thought form that you entertain and run with is either taking you away or towards a temple. And I think it's very important to understand what the nature of this is. Like, what is your truth? What is its relationship to Saturn's truth, which is the truth? It is the reality of this situation. And I think that that should be the center ornament of the temple that we're building, is to be here with it and to prostrate in some humble way in front of it. That Rumi says, our depression is caused by our inability to praise. A man who is depressed is a thief and steals from God in every moment. Well, if Saturn is the great architect of this reality, and so many people, especially people that are just getting into astrology, have such a nasty relationship to him. Oh, I'm in my Saturn return. Fuck Saturn. Whoa. It's like saying, oh my fucking God, and meaning it. Or fucking Christ, or whatever. All those cuss words, they're Saturnian by nature because they make your ears prick, they make you feel a certain way. And it's dark tongue. It doesn't exalt your heart or where your imagination can take you, but with praise and understanding how to put Shani at the center, that's Saturn, of all you do, trying your best to make him smile and approve of your actions by reaching out for mentors and stuff like this. Like, this is the point. To not be so attached to that tricky little voice in the back of your head that thinks you're immortal. No! It's like, who the hell would put a quarter in a machine that lasts forever? Death, impermanence is as natural as birth. It's a part of life. And I think that is Saturn work. That is, the reality is you're going to die. And everyone you love is going to die. And everything you have that you value so much is going to go away. That's just the reality of the third dimension. And this is why, to me, Saturn is the greatest teacher, because it teaches us how to value things, to treasure the moment, to really be present with everything that is happening and not try to run away. That in Scatterlings, or actually no, this is from Branson the Lightning Tree, Martin Shaw's first book. And there's no need to go into the myth, but it's basically a guy who's trying to run away from a family secret or a demon in the family. And this is so relevant to what I'm saying about Saturn. Martin writes, to stop running is to enter the field of longing, to be fragile, to incarnate fully. Our longing is like Blake's golden string, a barometer, a psychic timepiece that connects us to feeling, memory, and landscape. Its tenderness creates an inarguable accountability, a still, small voice that feeds the kingdom and that welcomes the baby daughter, but still knows what to shoot and what to feed, a nest of strange compassion. That you cannot run from your problems. There's no place you can move on the planet far enough away from your ex or your family or whomever it is to where there's an esper of a tricksy voice that is going to follow you and then manifest through another situation, through another human being. We have to address our situation, and I think the sweetness or the nectar, the honey, the tessellation of this whole situation is to fall in love with longing. And the longing of union with the divine is the ultimate, but even better, if you are longing for a partner, if you really know that you deserve a good relationship in your life, that longing should be cherished, not to be annoyed by, because there's a sweetness to it. There's such a tenderness to the effect of longing, and I think that we can thank Saturn for that feeling. It's not exactly ecstasy, but it's something that creates great poetry, an incredibly rich context in our life experience. And so to manifest the best life, to manifest the strongest relationship, to say understanding ourselves through astrology, we must put in the work. We got to stop complaining. We need to fall in love with the process. If you don't understand fully what Saturn is saying in your chart or what the transit is at the moment, don't worry about it. It's a process. Fall in love with the process. Find a teacher, find a mentor, do a program. Get astrology friends. Keep learning, right? Go deep. Get claimed by this material. We're spiritual machines, you know what I mean? And and I think one of the most important things as well with Saturn, healthy boundaries, not walls to keep people completely out, but boundaries is a really important thing, because there's a lot of folks in the world that are completely asleep. And when people are completely asleep, they know not what they do, Father, as Jesus said as he was being crucified. They know not what they do, because we're all victims of circumstance, of karma, if you will. And we're all doing our best. That's my take on it. Right? Very different parts of the spectrum. Time is a loop-de-loop. Perhaps even the symbol for Capricorn is like it's like a 5-year-old grabbing a crayon and just creating this symbol that looks like time. It looks like our path. Our path is not a ruler and a pen drawn as a perfect line. It's more like fisting a crayon and scribbling. Like, that's what time feels like and looks like, thanks to memory and our capacity to project into the future. This is all Saturn's domain. So I say, give yourself time, my friends. Very important. And so the last thing I want to do before I say goodnight, I'm recording this at night, is some final words from The Greatness of Saturn. I didn't think I'd read from this, but this is a great way to end, I think. It's actually the last paragraph of the book, technically, before the epilogue or the appendix. It's true. The Greatness of Saturn by Robert Savoda. Lord Saturn sits in front of each of us in every moment, inviting us to surrender moment by moment to reality, that we may be free. If you can live your life in continual remembrance of Saturn's presence, you will never need to mourn your fate, for you will have become truly conscious of the persuasiveness, of the realness of the real. It's a lot of real. Got to reel that in. I bow low now to that omnipresent Lord Saturn, who cannot be denied, and I offer him concentrated reverence from the depth of my humbled heart. My friends, that is a proper relationship to Saturn. So it is my deep hope that this podcast has changed your relationship to him just a little bit, that you can make peace with him, that you can use his promo code in my store to get a discount on all my readings except for the complete readings and the journeys. That maybe if you feel called, you join the apprenticeship and go on this year-long journey with all of us and meet astro buddies and community and I think I have a structure. I mean, I've been doing this over the 7-year itch. I've been teaching astrology for 8 years now, and the way that I've structured this program coming up, I think, is going to be a very powerful way to learn. And it's going to be a lot of interaction with each other. It's going to be a lot of giving readings to each other. It's going to be a lot of community building, which I think is absolutely essential in any learning process, is to be saturated, completely steeped in the material with people that you learn to love. This is how we make Saturn happy. This is how we become useful, right? And so I'm going to leave you with a song by my favorite Capricorn musician, for sure. Toss-up. There's a few of them. Eddie Vedder. I think Leonard Cohen. I don't know if Cohen is or not. Oh, I don't think he is. I think he's a Virgo. But Dave Matthews. But Jonathan Wilson at this point in my life has trumped all of them. And he's born with Sun conjunct Mercury in Capricorn, opposite Saturn. So a pretty Saturnian guy. He's a producer. He produces Father John Misty and a handful of others, and he has his own music as well. My favorite album of his is called Gentle Spirit. And the song you're about to hear is called Desert Raven, which very appropriately is going to be this track that I think encapsulates the feeling of Saturn on the rise. And so thank you so much for making it this far. If you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/exploringastrology. Also, iTunes has made it really easy with your podcast app. Just scroll down to leave some stars and a review. It's a great way to support the show. And long days and pleasant nights, my friends. Be well, be kind. And here's Jonathan Wilson with Desert Raven. I will talk with you next with Sherry to speak about the solstice and mugwort. Thank you again for listening to the podcast. Sorry I wasn't able to share the song. YouTube is a bit more strict than the podcast apps. So if you'd like to listen to the whole show, go over to Spotify, the podcast app, SoundCloud, or really wherever podcasts are found. This is Tree Theater. Ciao.